Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, where the PMP exam gets easier and easier. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we will be reviewing, and you will determine, how we approach, plan, and ultimately execute risk management-related activities on our project. We'll start out with the review of all the processes in project risk management and then jump into the details. So, we will discuss in particular the steps in planning, such as choosing proper visibility and defining and communicating how we manage risks. Examine process details like our inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. What the single output of this process, the risk management plan, contains and why it is important. And we also look at the risk breakdown structure, what it is and how it is used. We begin with the definition of the knowledge area. Project risk management includes the processes of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response, and controlling risk on a project. And you know this by now, this definition always translates into the activities and the processes that follow. And of course, the first little circle that you see there at the top, planning, that is the focus of this lesson here. So let's jump into our 6 processes. Planning is the first step in project risk management, and the process is called plan risk management. That's the process of defining how to conduct risk management activities for your project. Once we have a plan, we move on to identifying our risks. That's the process of determining which risks may affect the project and documenting their characteristics. Then we get into 2 analysis processes, beginning with perform qualitative risk analysis, which is the process of prioritizing risks for further analysis or action by assessing and combining their probability of occurrence and impact, at the end of which we know the risks that are low, medium, and high. And then we take, usually, the risks that are high on our list and move them into the next process, which is perform quantitative risk analyses. The process of numerically analyzing the effect of identified risks on overall project objectives. And the key word here is numerically. At the end of this process, we will have a number, usually a currency figure. It'll cost us 100,000 euros, $250,000 if this risk occurs. Now it's time to plan risk responses in the process of developing options and actions to enhance opportunities and to reduce threats to project objectives. And finally, we also want to control our risks. This is the process of implementing risk response plans, tracking identified risks, monitoring residual risks, identifying new risks, and evaluating risk process effectiveness throughout the project. As a reminder, the processes in this knowledge area, most of them fall into the planning process group, with the exception there of control risks at the end. So our focus right now is on the first process, plan risk management. And of course, the name gives it all away. It's part of the process group of planning. The main concept that you should remember is that in this process, we are not interested in planning how you will be managing the actual individual risks. Instead, we are interested in planning how to approach and execute the risk management activities overall on our project. You decide on and plan for activities that will help you execute project risk management. For instance, how will we identify our risks? How will we define probability and impact of risks? that we have identified? What techniques will we employ to define risk response strategies, and how will we control our risk during the life of the project? In other words, we want to create the risk management plan in this process. That's why the definition of this process in the PMBOK guide says that this is the process of defining how to conduct risk management activities for a project. See, it doesn't talk about the individual risks by themselves. It talks about the risk management activities as a whole. By planning your risk management approach early in the project lifecycle, you will ensure that risk management receives the appropriate visibility to the stakeholders and corresponds with the size and strategic importance of your project. You'll very likely plan for high visibility in a large strategic project and low visibility on a project that is the fourth in a series of 6 similar small projects. Of course, this visibility to the stakeholders is just one aspect. Similarly, you will want to define the resources that are needed for risk management, how risks get documented and escalated, or how they are communicated to the stakeholders. And these are just 3 aspects of the risk management plan out of a greater number that need to be defined. The idea is that by defining and documenting them in your risk management plan, the activities receive the attention that is proportional to the project's importance to the company. And let me repeat that this process should be done early on in the project. We are moving on to the review of the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, and here is the figure of those ITTOs from the PMBOK guide. And one thing that becomes obvious here is, take a look at the outputs. We have one single output, the risk management plan. Remember, this here is the first of the 5 planning processes, and usually if you have a planning process at the beginning of a knowledge area, it means you're developing a plan. Here, the risk management plan. All right, quick overview here of the inputs to plan risk management. We have the project management plan. Then we have the project charter, the stakeholder register, the enterprise environmental factors, and also some organizational process assets. Let's take a look at why these are important inputs in helping us create our risk management plan at the end of the process. Our first input is the project management plan, which will definitely influence the risk management plan processes. In preparing the risk management plan, all management plans and baselines must be considered in order for the risk management plan to be consistent with them. The project management plan contains many subsidiary components, such as the scope baseline, which itself contains a subsidiary document, the project scope statement. Then we have the cost management plan, we have the schedule management plan, and the communications management plan. The information contained in each of these components is essential, since these are all risk-affected areas. They all have specific and inherent risk. Next, we have the project charter, which contains these high-level informations and inputs. First of all, we have risks in there already identified in the project charter. The relevance of this information is obvious. We have already identified risks as we created the project charter, so we should use them as we are planning our risk management approaches. Then we have a project description. This will help us determine the importance of the project to the organization and thus the appropriate degree and visibility that we need to give to our risk management approach. We have the requirements in there. This can shed light on how much risk is inherent on our project. Many complex requirements means a lot of risk. Fewer, simpler requirements means lower risk. Assumptions and constraints are also part of the project charter, and both of these directly relate to the level and type of risk in a project. What do you think happens when one of our assumptions suddenly proves no longer valid? Well, risk increases, risk goes up. Our third input is the stakeholder register. If you recall from lessons about communications management, stakeholder management, this stakeholder register contains a variety of details about project stakeholders. And why is this important to risk management planning? Well, this document will inform you, the project manager, based on their power, title, position, level of interest, which stakeholders are likely to impact the project. Stakeholders with high potential impact will very likely need and expect to be involved in the planning of risk management activities, since they typically can provide or limit resources. Their ability to influence risk is substantial. Secondly, the stakeholder register will contain the classification of the project stakeholders. Are they supporters, resistors, champions? Risk planning has to include information about who may cause risk, like a resistor, and who can reduce risk, like a champion. In essence, this information helps you as the project manager to associate a level of risk to a stakeholder. The better the project manager knows their stakeholders and level of influence, the more effective and purposeful risk planning will be. From the enterprise environmental factors, we usually take risk attitudes, thresholds, and tolerances of stakeholders as well as the sponsoring organization. And the most important question is always, why do we need these enterprise environmental factors here? Okay, for example, a young and dynamic startup company is very likely to take on higher risk. They are willing to try out new technology, to boldly go where no man has gone before in order to reap the greatest rewards. They are risk seekers. On the other hand, older, established companies might be more reluctant to do this. They may be conservative and have less tolerance toward risk. They may be risk-averse and avoid it. Let's take a closer look at these risk attitudes. All members of your project will have a certain attitude towards risk, and generally speaking, we know 4 categories of these risk attitudes, beginning with risk-averse. A risk-averse person is uncomfortable with uncertainty. They don't like it if they don't know the outcome of something. If it's difficult to define a result, then they will be itchy. Risk neutral means that a risk neutral person, they embrace risk for their future payoff. They look at a risk as an opportunity and a way for the future payoff. The risk seekers, on the other hand, they look at risk as a challenge. Having a risk on their project excites them, and they believe that it will all work out in the end. And then we have the risk-tolerant people. They don't worry too much about risk. If they see a risk, they are indifferent, and it doesn't really influence them much. And when the risk actually manifests as an issue, then they are usually very surprised. Knowing the attitudes of your stakeholders is an important factor when planning risk management. It will tell you how to communicate risks to the stakeholders, and it will also tell you what general approach, like prudent or aggressive, to take towards risk. Remember on the previous slide, young company versus an older company? If you're working for a young and dynamic risk-seeking company, you may consider, well, we're going for the risk, but consider this. Because you're implementing a project for the financial department, the finance department, the CFO, who is your sponsor, has more of a risk-averse attitude on this project, because the results of what you're developing here, that will impact your financial system. You can't take a lot of risk there. So you have to know the risk attitudes of your sponsors, of your stakeholders, in order to properly manage risk on your project. Our final input organizational process assets. And here it's worth noting that companies themselves has a certain approach in how they manage risk, and this approach will be documented and defined in the organizational process assets that this young lady here is handing over to us. Some of these assets, they can influence the planned risk management process, including the following: policies and procedures. These will typically describe how risk management is to be performed on a project. Risk categories and lists. Maybe your company has risk categories or even complete listings of possible risks on certain project types. Or maybe your company has a glossary of risk terms that you can use to educate your stakeholders in risk management. Your company might even have templates for risk management activities. These might be as simple as a template for your risk register. Or your company might have documented roles and responsibilities for risk management. Often companies will define levels of authority when it comes to making decisions on risks. And of course, let's not forget that your company may have ready-made risk management plans for you. Typically, a wealth of information about risk management can be obtained from reviewing project retrospectives and interviewing experienced project managers. The good thing about organizational process assets is, well, they exist. They represent best practices within your company, within your organization from past projects, and they will make your life easier. They will make your life easier because you don't have to reinvent all these assets from scratch. All right, we have talked enough about the inputs for this process. Let's go ahead and do something. There are 3 tools and techniques in the plan risk management process that use the inputs we just described, and they are analytical techniques, expert judgment, and meetings. Let's take a look in more detail. In regards to analytical techniques, mention just 2 here. We have, for instance, risk profile analysis and strategic risk scoring sheets. These are techniques used to define the risk management context of the project, which is a combination of stakeholder risk attitudes and strategic risk exposure within the overall project context. Keys to establishing this context require you to determine who cares, what do they care about, how much do they care about it. To determine the answer to who, what, and how much, you must engage your stakeholders and map their issues, the commitment they demonstrate to manage risk, and their ownership of the risk management context defined. With the risk management context defined and commitments secured, the appropriate resources can now be allocated to risk management planning and responses to address the risks. Early on in establishing your risk management context, it is critically important to establish assessment criteria which reflect an organization's risk appetite and tolerance. Once our risk management context is defined, then the next step is to use this analysis to plan and execute your risk planning meetings. A successful risk planning team will include the project manager, selected members of the project team, stakeholders, and experts from within and without the company. The idea is to invite those people that have a certain responsibility on the project or expertise when it comes to risk management. So you see, we're kind of taking the other 2 tools and techniques, expert judgment and meetings, and we're putting them together into sort of one tool and technique. We meet and we use their expertise. And what do you do in these meetings? Well, you will be defining your fundamental strategies of how risk management will be performed on the project. You may define certain risk-related deliverables that need to be included in the work breakdown structure. This will lead you to realizing that you need activities on your schedule, and that again will lead to adding additional components into your budget, which touches cost management. Remember, all these policies and procedures and template that we have as inputs from the organizational process assets, in your meetings you will analyze them and you will adapt them to your project. What good is a standard risk register with 2,000 listed risks if you don't review it and make sure that they actually apply on your project? And all of this work will be documented in our one single output. And of course, that one single output is the risk management plan. Like other plans, the risk management plan is a subsidiary plan of the overall project management plan. It can be broadly framed or detailed. It can be formal, informal. It's all based on the needs of the project. And this plan has to be communicated very well to the stakeholders so that they can approve it and support it in order for us to ensure proper execution of the plan on our project. At its core, the risk management plan tells you how risk management will be structured and performed on your project. Again, we're not talking about how to respond to individual risks. We are talking about how to manage the overall approach to risk management as a major process on your project, the methodology which describes approaches, tools, or where your risk data will come from. Then we have authority. Here you talk about who on the project will have which roles and responsibilities in executing the risk management processes. Again, not interested who is responsible for an individual risk. We are defining who is responsible, say, for monitoring all of the risks. Then we have the cost for risk management. This is something else the risk management plan talks about, the budget. We need resources to manage our risks, so we need to estimate a budget that will be part of the project baseline, contingency and management reserves. Since we have resources assigned to these tasks, we also have to talk about timing and scheduling in the risk management plan. We will describe when and how often our processes are executed. For instance, we will define that there will be an official risk review meeting once a month, but risk monitoring will be executed weekly. We also need to define risk categories in the plan. This can be in the form of a simple list or in the form of a risk breakdown structure. In one of the later presentations here in risk management, we will need to define the probability and impact for each of our risks. In order to do that, we need to include in the risk management plan the basic definition for risk probability and impact. What does risk probability mean? What does risk impact mean? To us, to our project. A probability and impact matrix is a good tool to have in your plan. Then the risk management plan also contains information about the stakeholder risk attitudes and risk tolerances. After all, your risk tolerance is different from activity to activity, and for stakeholders it's the same from project to project. We have two more items in the plan, and they are the reporting formats that define how we document and report information about risks, and finally the tracking, which documents how we will be documenting our risk management activities so that we can use this in the future lessons learned. You can see that there is quite a bit of information contained in the risk management plan, which makes it a perfect target for sample exam questions. But before we get to any questions, let's keep looking through our risk management plan and see what else we will find in the plan itself. We may find a risk breakdown structure in there, but not the risk breakdown structure for each individual risk, but instead here, as you see it, a risk breakdown structure in regards to categories. So like all the other breakdown structures, the risk breakdown structure is a graphical hierarchical structure, and in this particular case here, as we are developing the risk management plan, we want to create it for our risk categories. You could have high-level categories like business, infrastructure, technical, external, internal, organizational, or managerial. And these are then again subdivided into low-level categories. Each project will have a different RBS with many more or fewer levels. It all depends on the project. The idea here is that in the plan we put in this risk category, so to speak, a breakdown structure in which we show, hey, these are the categories for which we are going to want to identify our risks later on. We also find definitions for probability and impact in the risk management plan. This is an important step in risk management planning. It requires the project manager and the risk management team to create specific definitions for the levels of probability and impact on the project. These definitions are documented in the risk management plan, and they then later on serve as the basis for future risk management activities. These definitions are therefore required before we can perform the qualitative and quantitative analysis of risk, which we will cover in the appropriate lesson on that particular process. And as with many things, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to defining probability and impact. While you will be using the organizational process assets, experience of other project managers and risk management experts, the definitions, they will have to be specifically tailored to the project context that you're working in. Since we learned that a risk can be both positive and negative impact, our definitions and the tools we use to define probability and impact should be able to account for each type of impact that we have. Relative terms like high, medium, and low, and numerical values are commonly used both individually and together in defining levels of probability and impact. In the previous slide, we looked at defining levels of probability, high, medium, low, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever the level may be for our project. That's important, but how do we then actually use these levels? How do we accomplish the application of probability and impact on our project? What methodology or approach should we employ to establish our definitions? Okay. As a first step, let's compile a list of risk-affected objectives such as time, cost, scope, or quality. Then we determine a scale or a set of terms to describe our levels, like the 5-point scale or low, medium, high, or both. And finally, we need to apply specific criteria that define the levels that we have chosen. For instance, a medium impact on time may have a criteria of a 5 to 10% time increase. Sounds all a bit theoretical? Well, a very helpful approach for defining probability and impact is the use of lookup tables. These tables are in essence a framework to capture the steps that we have just discussed. And as soon as you see the table, the last slide and this slide here will make absolute sense. Let's take a look. So this here is the cost impact definition table. And the most important word here is definition. So this goes into our risk management plan and defines, well, how we're going to measure and assign cost impact to our risk. Okay, so in the table we have 3 columns for the rating, the description, and the criteria. And what we want to do is we're assuming we have a 5-point scale from 1 to 5. But what does a cost impact of 1 actually mean? Rating of 1. What does a cost impact rating of 5 actually mean? That's what we are going to discuss here. So let's start with a risk rating here of 1 on project cost. This rating and its impact is described as very low. And the specific criteria that defined this impact as equal to 1 or low is a cost deviation of less or equal to 3% of the total cost. So later on, when we look at a risk and we see, oh, this risk has probably a cost impact of less or equal to 3% if it actually happens, well then, this is a very low risk and very low impact risk, so we're giving it a rating of 1. Similarly, if we have the rating of 2, this is, as the description here, a low risk, and here the cost deviation, the cost overrun, has to be above the 3% that we had before, but not exceed 10%. And so on for all of the 5 ratings. So now that we have this table defined in our risk management plan, later on we can refer back to it. We can take each individual risk and say, this risk here, if it occurs, will increase the cost by 32%. Where does it fall? It falls somewhere between 3 and 4, so this becomes a rating 4. This is a high risk in regards to cost impact. This table here is defined in our risk management plan and later on used to assign the impact of cost to our individual risks. That's it for the examples of what goes into our risk management plan. And when we talk about sample questions that you will find in books and in online simulators, well, they do focus on the risk management plan itself. That's because this process really has just one major output as the risk management plan. So you need to know the components that it contains. You need to know in which process it is first created, of course, here in Plan Risk Management. And we have also seen sample questions that show you a probability and impact matrix. And the question there was, what probability is assigned to a 20% cost overrun? And you are then going to have to take a look at the matrix and find the appropriate answers in the boxes. So a similar table that you have seen on the previous slide, a rather easy thing to do, to just look up and find the correct number in the table. Let's review. Plan risk management is a process that you start early on in your project. And at this stage, we're not really interested in planning and managing the actual individual risks. Instead, we are interested in planning how to approach and execute the risk management activities, the risk management processes on our project. By planning your risk management approach like this early on, we will ensure that risk management receives the appropriate visibility to the stakeholders and corresponds with the size and strategic importance of the project in the organization overall. Risk attitudes and risk tolerances of both the company and our stakeholders are an important input, and of course the risk management plan is our only output. Before we go, let me remind you of some important PMP exam study techniques. First of all, don't try and pack all your studying into the week before your exam. That's not going to work. You're going to have to do a little bit of studying every day for several weeks, usually about 8 to 10 weeks before the exam. And you should also not try and watch too many of our lessons here on the Prepcast all at once. Instead, watch them regularly. You will be much more alert. You will retain much more information if you just watch 1 or 2 of our lessons here at a time. Just imagine if you listen to 5, 6 or 7 in a row. Your mind will start drifting. Your brain will slowly start turning into pudding, and you will not take in the information anymore. We have now reached the end of this Prepcast lesson, so it's time for Justine to say,
Fare thee well in your travels, and may by fate we meet again.
And of course I say, until next time.